The Civil War wasn't something that just happened. It was a long, simmering pot, slowly heated until it became a boiling mess far past the point of no return. And make no mistakes, the first salvos of the conflict did not come courtesy of rifle shots on battlefields in 1861. They came instead on debate stages, on the floors of Congress, and in hundreds of newspapers printed across the country. For his part, Schuyler Colfax was caught in the crossfire of all of it. A particularly inflammatory Virginia newspaper even printed an advertisement offering a bounty on the heads of abolitionist politicians in 1860, and Schuyler Colfax's face was right there with them, listed with a reward of $2,500. Some historians have argued that the Civil War was an inevitable conflict, that the nation had been heading in one way or another toward a showdown ever since the framers of the Constitution allowed states the freedom to agree to disagree about the question of slavery. But if conflict had been inevitable, at least there had once been a time when the inevitability seemed far away. By the 1850s, it was looming. For some time, the bickering nation had been held together by the strength of its two parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. Neither of these parties was an overtly pro-slavery party, and neither was overtly anti-slavery. There were abolitionist Democrats and slaveholding Democrats. Schuyler Colfax was a northern anti-slavery Whig, but he deeply respected and admired Henry Clay, a southern Whig who enslaved at least 120 humans. But by 1852, Henry Clay was dead, and the Whig Party was on its way toward extinction. When it seemed that slavery was poised to spread into new territories and new states, the Northern Whigs could no longer abide the Southern ones. The Northern Whigs abandoned the party in droves, splintering into a handful of different regional parties, each one a collection of anti-slavery Whigs, combined with a handful of anti-slavery Democrats. By the middle part of the 1850s, those regional parties had coalesced into one new and overarching entity, the Republican Party. When the dust settled and the political allegiances were fully shifted, the Republicans became the Northern Party that largely opposed slavery. The Democrats became the Northern Party that fought to protect it, and the Democrats determined that if the nation ever put one of those Northern Republicans into the White House, then there was going to be a fight. But in 1855, the Republican Party was only barely formed, still trying to figure out what and who it was. Before Abraham Lincoln could become the nation's first Republican president, the party was going to need to be organized. When Schuyler Colfax made the trip to Washington to serve his first congressional term in 1855 at the age of 31, he wasn't even a Republican yet, but he would be soon enough, and he would become one of the most important early voices in the party's history. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series, we are going to dive into the life of South Bend's own Schuyler Colfax. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of the entire series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all that out of the way, let's follow Schuyler Colfax to Washington, D.C. in 1855, where, at the age of 31, he's been elected to his first term as the representative from Indiana's 9th District, a member of the People's Party of Indiana, a political entity not quite ready to call itself Republican. It was a different time in the nation's history, a time when being a congressman was considered a much more part-time gig. And so, in the wake of his election victory, Schuyler Colfax returned immediately to his work as a newspaper editor. It was at least something to keep him from just twiddling his thumbs until it was time to go to Washington, but when he arrived at the nation's capital, there was going to be plenty of work to do. Colfax had the privilege, or more accurately misfortune, of spending his freshman term in the midst of the most dysfunctional House of Representatives the young nation had ever seen. Colfax had won his seat in fall of 1854, but the Congress would not be called into session until December 1855, more than a full year after the election had come and gone. This was not uncommon, and was in fact the standard schedule at the time. The only time the Congress convened sooner was when the President called a special session, and this time around, President Franklin Pierce declined to convene a special session under the reasoning that the Congress was too divided to get anything done. He wasn't wrong. When the House of Representatives convened on December 3rd, their first order of business was to elect a Speaker of the House, and until they could do that, they couldn't do anything else. The problem facing the House of Representatives was that the Whig Party had been shattered and then been reformed with several different names. There was the American Party, there were a few early Republicans. Colfax himself had won election as a member of Indiana's People's Party. Each of these parties was different enough that they had trouble agreeing on much except their opposition to the Democrats and their opposition to the expansion of slavery. Democrats held about a third of the seats in the House, not nearly enough to win the Speaker's seat for themselves. As for the rest of them, well, they'd have to have it out for themselves, and it was going to get more than a little ugly getting there. It took 2 months and 133 votes before the anti-Democrats finally worked out their differences and put Nathaniel Banks into the Speaker's chair. 2 months had passed by the time the agreement had been struck, and the House could at last begin its work. As a rookie, Colfax was hardly a central figure in the whole affair, but he did what he could, working as a mediator when his own common friends had conflicts with one another, and casting a vote on behalf of his district in each of the 133 occasions he had chance to do so. Electing a speaker may have permitted the House to begin its work, but it hardly broke the legislative deadlock in Washington. The Senate was firmly in the hands of the Democrats, and the House firmly in the hands of the anti-Democrats. Neither was keen to work with the other. Never more obvious than when South Carolina Democratic Representative Preston Brooks marched from the House and into the Senate chambers, where he alighted upon Massachusetts Republican Charles Sumner and beat the man unconscious with a cane, in defiance of and in front of the entire legislative body. The offense? Sumner had delivered an anti-slavery speech that harshly insulted Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Brooks was Butler's second cousin, and called the caning a defense of his family honor. No wonder Schuyler Colfax's mom didn't want her son to become a politician. And even though Colfax wasn't really a part of the senatorial caning incident, I feel like you probably want to know how that story ended. Sumner recovered from his injuries and continued to serve in the Senate for another decade. As for Brooks, he was censured for his actions, but never faced a criminal charge. After his censure, he resigned from his seat and was then immediately re-elected to it. He died shortly thereafter. Anyway, this was the Washington, D.C. that Schuyler Colfax found himself in the middle of, one in which senators and representatives resigned themselves to the fact that there wasn't going to be much happening in the way of legislation. The rest of 1856 turned into a parade of endless debates and political posturing designed to look good in newspapers and to hopefully influence the next election cycle. In 1856, the House and the Senate managed to pass exactly one significant piece of legislation, the Guano Islands Act, a law that allowed any American citizen to claim any unclaimed island, no matter how remote, in the name of the United States, so long as, and this is true, the island had sufficient amounts of bird droppings on it. Don't laugh too much. Guano, the technical name for those bird droppings, was a valuable fertilizer, and in the coming years, the U.S. would use this act to claim hundreds of islands, and as of 2025, the nation still claims 6 small Pacific islands by virtue of this piece of legislation. But to a modern listener, perhaps the best analogy we can make to explain Schuyler Colfax's first year in Congress was that the only thing the House and the Senate could agree upon was that bird poop was good. During that first year, freshman Congressman Schuyler Colfax was appointed to exactly one committee, the Committee on Elections. It was a relatively unimportant assignment, exactly the kind that a first-year representative should expect to receive. But soon enough, there would be election problems in Kansas rooted in the question of slavery. Colfax's committee, and Colfax himself, would be thrust into more attention than anyone expected. The prevailing sentiment in the nation was that Kansas represented a terrifying tipping point. If Kansas became a slave state, then so too would every new state admitted to the Union. Presumably, it would create an opening for northern states to choose slavery for themselves if they wanted to. That's why pro-slavery forces were trying to stack the vote in Kansas, trying to ensure that the place would make itself the nation's next slave state, and anti-slavery forces were trying to do the same thing. As a member of the Committee on Elections, Colfax's job was to make sure that the election was fair, no matter the outcome, and the committee determined that it wasn't, uncovering some fairly blatant and poorly hidden voter fraud, then recommending that a pair of delegates from Kansas be thrown out. For Schuyler Colfax, this wasn't just an administrative issue. It was a chance to capitalize on an amount of attention not usually afforded to first-year congressmen stuck on the Elections Committee. He gave a speech on the floor of the House that denounced the Kansas Codes, a set of laws that would have made it illegal to even speak out against slavery in the territory. Colfax's speech ended with a flourish when the congressman produced a 30-pound iron ball from inside his own desk. Colfax asked future Confederate Vice President Alexander H. Stephens to test its weight, and then he requested that Stephens hold the weight for him until he was finished speaking. Colfax then lambasted the code by showing how the writings of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Henry Clay would have made them criminals under the Kansas codes, each one of them subject to be condemned to a chain gang and tethered to the same type of steeled ball that by the end of his speech, Stephens was struggling to hold on to. The goal of the speech was to gain support for an amendment he had proposed, one which would prohibit the federal government from using the military to uphold pro-slavery laws that had been passed in Kansas until such a time as the elections that passed those laws could be shown to be above board. In the end, Colfax didn't get his amendment, but people did take notice of the man who made the speech. Papers in New Jersey, Chicago, and Washington praised Colfax for having made one of the best speeches of the entire dysfunctional session, and more than 1 million copies of his words were printed and distributed throughout the nation. As the sun set on Schuyler Colfax's first term in office, there wasn't much to celebrate in the way of legislation, but his political star was shining brighter than ever. In the summer and fall of 1856, Colfax returned to South Bend, where he won another election in District 9, and when we come back from the break, we'll follow him through his sophomore term in Washington.
Encourage home manufacturers when you purchase your next ride at the Carriage and Wagon Factory of Henry and Clement Studebaker at the corner of Michigan and Jefferson Streets. None but the best of workmen are employed by this factory, and when you ride in one of Studebaker's carriages, the results show. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
The 1856 election had been good for Schuyler Colfax, but it hadn't been good for his cause. The shattered Whig Party struggled to unite, and instead a pair of anti-Democrat candidates canvassed for the presidency, John C. Fremont as a Republican, and former President Millard Fillmore made a last gasp for the Whigs. Fremont and Fillmore effectively split the vote, a move which delivered the White House to Democrat James Buchanan. The Democrats kept control of the Senate by a wide margin, and they also took control of the House. Colfax was given another unimportant committee assignment, this time to the House Committee on Indian Affairs, and realizing that he would be unable to push any part of his agenda through against the overwhelmingly Democratic majority, Colfax set to the work of politicking, hoping to plant seeds that might bloom in future elections. He continued to speak out early and often against slavery, and especially against its expansion. He spoke out against admitting Utah as a state, until such a time as the state agreed to prohibit polygamy within its borders. Colfax was esteemed highly among his colleagues as an orator, and he was called upon twice during his second term to pronounce eulogies over a pair of expired senators, Josiah Evans of South Carolina and James Bell of New Hampshire. When Congress wasn't in session, and especially during his earliest terms in office, Colfax usually returned to South Bend, sometimes even retaking editorial control of the newspaper for weeks at a time. He supported friends in local elections, but he tended to save his voice for issues of national concern, and he didn't spend ink writing much about the local political issues facing South Bend. And then it was time for his second term to begin. As had been the case during the first term, there wasn't much in the way of legislation. The Democrats in charge liked things the way they were, thank you very much. And anyway, they were dealing with their own schism in the ranks, the same way the Whigs had just a few years earlier. Things became contentious and violent, never more so than when a late-night legislative session devolved into a 50-man brawl on the floor of the House of Representatives at 2 a.m. on February 6, 1858. So far as we can tell, Schuyler Colfax stayed out of the fracas, at least in a physical sense. In every other way, he was right in the thick of it. The issue in the middle of it all was Kansas, the same issue that had propelled Colfax to victory in 1854, which by now must have felt like a very long time ago. Colfax's position had been that slavery should not be allowed to expand, and the Democrats had been of the mind that new states should get to choose for themselves if they would permit slavery. The Democrats won that debate. By 1858, though, it was clear that if the people of Kansas were to vote on the issue fairly, then they would not choose to allow slavery in their state. And so Colfax and others in his party changed their tune. They thought that the Kansans should have the right to choose so long as they chose justly. And for their part, the Southern Democrats planned not to let the vote happen justly. Colfax spoke out time and again against the attempt to hijack the will of the people, and newspapers across the country lauded the representative from South Bend as one of the ablest speakers on the issue of the Kansas problem. It's not known if Colfax's words were responsible for the decision of some Northern Democrats to break party ranks, but either way, that's exactly what happened next. Stephen Douglas, a prominent congressman from Illinois, was the most notable one to split from his Southern comrades, refusing to support anything except a free and transparent vote among the people of Kansas. In the coming years, the schism would break the Democrats in half, and the rest of the country wouldn't be far behind. We'll inch closer toward the coming conflict when we get back from the break.
Gold! Gold! Will you be the first South Benders to tap into the beauty, adventure, and fortune waiting for you at Pikes Peak? If you are, make sure to contact E.R. Farnham of the Aetna Life Insurance Company to make sure your coverage is up to date. Remember what E.R. Farnham says, death is inevitable. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
A few years earlier, the Whigs had split over the issue of slavery, and the Democrats seized power in offices across the nation when the schism left a political hole that needed to be filled. Now, it was the Democrats' turn to split, and Schuyler Colfax's newly formed Republicans were ready to fill the void the splintered Democrats had left behind. Colfax returned to South Bend in summer of 1858 to campaign for a third term. He traveled the region, making 101 speeches in a span of less than 6 weeks, and he won the vote in a landslide. It's worth noting here that in the 1850s, Indiana was one of a handful of states that voted for its representatives in October. Most of the rest of the nation voted in November. That means that Colfax had won his own re-election just as the other campaigns across the country were boiling to a fever pitch. And as a prominent politician in his own right, Colfax was called upon to provide aid in other crucial battleground elections. In 1858, that meant Illinois. And so that's where Schuyler Colfax went, taking up a front row seat for the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Colfax was supposed to have been present as an impartial observer, a newspaperman with a newspaperman's interest in the proceedings. But Colfax was also a shrewd politician, and he must have recognized the incredible weight of the moment. It wasn't until years later that a collection of Lincoln's letters was made public, and then came the discovery that Schuyler Colfax had written letters cheering for and advising Abraham Lincoln during that 1858 Senate campaign. Of course, Lincoln lost that election, but he was well positioned for a bigger, more important one in the future. For Schuyler Colfax, though, it was another instance where he might not have been the most consequential man in the room, but he was one of them, and it was a very, very important room. By the time his career was over, he would sit in many of them. A year later, in 1859, Colfax began his third term in the House of Representatives, and it was certainly a strange one. The Civil War was now just 2 years away, not that anyone knew it yet, and the tensions around the issues of slavery and secession had never been more tangible. Colfax remarked himself that a new and unsettling thing was happening on the floor of the House during this session. He'd heard talks of disunion and secession threatened by angry representatives during fiery speeches plenty of times, but it was in 1859, for the first time, that those threats were met with cheers and applause. The whole mess alarmed Colfax, but while slavery was the first and most pressing issue on his mind, it wasn't the only thing on his list. Colfax was appointed chairman of the House Committee on Post Offices during a time when mail services needed reformation and expansion. Schuyler Colfax was in the middle of the effort to extend postal service into parts of what would later become Colorado, a move that became especially important when they struck gold out west. Colfax took a keen interest in the New West, which we'll talk about more in a future episode, but for now we'll focus on Colfax's actions at the House. He was the first to introduce the act that would have made Colorado officially a territory in 1859, although in Colfax's version the place was called Kelowna. This act wasn't passed through, but if it had been, it's likely the state of Colorado would have held on to that different name until today. But the chief issue of the day was still slavery, and an increasing threat of Southern disunion. There wasn't much that Colfax, or any legislator, could do about the growing divide between the North and the South, at least not when it came to writing and passing laws. So Colfax, like everyone else, focused his energies on the coming presidential election of 1860. Like he almost always seemed to do, Schuyler Colfax found himself right in the middle of it. In the months leading up to one of the most consequential political races in the history of American politics, Schuyler Colfax threw his weight and support behind Edward Bates, a candidate from Missouri. Bates was considered something of a compromise candidate. He is from the South, and well connected throughout the South. He was a former enslaver who had emancipated all of his slaves by 1851, even though there were no legal requirements to do so. Bates vehemently opposed the expansion of slavery and wished there was some way to abolish the institution altogether without breaking apart the nation, but he knew that there wasn't, and he valued keeping the nation together even more than he valued bringing an immediate end to slavery. Colfax hoped that Bates would be able to build bridges between the North and the South and to keep the whole country together, no matter how tense a relationship it was. On the other side was William H. Seward, a longtime senator from and former governor of New York. Seward was radically abolitionist. Some thought he was too far left to win more conservative northern states like Indiana or Illinois. Others were certain that a Seward victory would lead to immediate Southern recession, and as we'll learn, they were probably right. In the middle of those two was Abraham Lincoln. For his part, Colfax liked Lincoln. It would probably be fair to say that Colfax admired Lincoln. But in the political climate of 1960, disunion seemed certain under Seward, and it seemed likely under Lincoln. In Colfax's opinion, Bates was the only chance the United States had at sticking together. In his private letters, Colfax called Bates a modest, unassuming man, not disposed to reach out for the presidency, but of course, one who would not decline it. Later, he called Bates, probably accurately, an anti-slavery extensionist and a practical emancipationist. Colfax wrote often in the St. Joseph Valley Register about the strengths of Bates. Bates represented a love of the South and the North. Seward represented vengeance against the South. He worried what a Lincoln or Seward nomination would do to the country as a whole. It was against this backdrop that Colfax received a letter from Abraham Lincoln just a few days after the 4th of July, 1860. Lincoln did not pander directly for Colfax's support, but he did ingratiate himself to the representative from South Bend just a little bit. All of this was a part of Lincoln's long game in the 1860 election, an attempt to become everyone's second favorite choice, and the man they would rally around after the early ballots didn't return a clean majority. Lincoln's strategy played out exactly as planned. At the 1860 Republican National Convention, it was Seward, not Lincoln, who jumped out to first place after the first ballot, but with plenty of other names on the list, Seward didn't nearly have a clear majority, and it took a majority to win. Seward also had plenty of enemies who were eager to keep the New York radical from winning the nomination, and competing delegates rallied around Abraham Lincoln as a kind of compromise candidate. In fact, it was when the men of Indiana moved on from Bates to Lincoln that the matter was finally settled. But for the first time in a long time, Schuyler Colfax wasn't in the room where it happened. Congress was still in session, Colfax was in Washington, and it was uglier than it had ever been before. Back home in South Bend, Colfax's newspaper ran a celebratory blurb about the events at the Republican convention. With no ordinary feelings of gratification do we this week hoist at our masthead the name of Abraham Lincoln of Illinois for president and that of Hannibal Hamlin of Maine for vice president. They are both eminently worthy of the earnest and enthusiastic support of every lover of his country, and we regard their election as absolutely certain. The announcement of their nomination has aroused a spirit of harmony and enthusiasm unparalleled since the memorable campaign of 1849. We have yet to hear the first word of dissent in the ranks of the opponents of latter-day democracy. All is union, all is harmony, all is enthusiasm. But of course, it wouldn't stay that way for long. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks to Andy and Tina Nickel for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in the series. Our next episode will follow Schuyler Colfax from the start of the Civil War into the Speaker's chair in the House of Representatives and beyond. I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.